the Middle Ages aren't known as being a particularly good time to be a woman. If you were poor, you were at the mercy of the powerful. If you were rich, you became a pawn in a twisted web of political alliances that's inspired plots from the Game of Thrones. Women were explicitly barred from entering the new university system, and although some of them took the veil and became nuns, all were forbidden to hold religious authority over men. This is not a talk about oppression, however. This is a story of three remarkable women, Hadwich, Catherine of Siena, and Julian of Norwich, who each found their own ways of transcending the walls, both metaphorical and actual, that were set up around them. It's also a talk about what we can learn from their example. Hadwich is sometimes known as Hadwich of Brabant or Hadwich of Antwerp, but we don't actually know where she's from. In fact, we don't know very much about her at all. What we do know, we know from inferring from things that she wrote about. And it's this, what she wrote, that makes her such an interesting figure for us. Hadwich was a Beguine. Most of you guys probably don't know what that is, so let me explain for a second. In the mid-1200s and on, for about a century, there was a marked increase in women entering religious orders, but not as nuns. Instead, they were lay women who lived in communities with each other and dedicated themselves to spiritual improvement. They frequently fed the poor, ministered to the sick, and were often involved in education. Some of them were, in fact, quite well educated. And Hadwich is one person that we know was quite well educated, in part because of all of the references she makes in her own work to popular culture of the time. What popular culture? Troubadours and courtly love. So in the 12th and 13th century, there is this wide movement that you guys have probably all heard about of poets who composed and performed songs about chivalry and love for the noble courts. If you know any of the King Arthur legends about Lancelot and Guinevere, or if you know the story of Tristan and Isolde, you can probably thank a troubadour. They wrote highly stylized poetry about the ideal love between a knight and his lady, who is usually married to his lord. The knight is always the lover, the lady, the beloved. And the knight writes passionate poetry that's both erotic and pure about the beauty of his lady and about his desire to attain her, and often about his despair at her unavailability. In short, one thing that courtly love consistently emphasizes is this tension between desire and attainment, physical passion, and the kind of spiritual transcendence that love can provide. Hadwich transcends literary boundaries by taking this body of literature and using the same tropes of love and longing, desire, satisfaction, ecstasy, despair, to portray the quest of the soul as the loved for God, the beloved. Her poems demonstrate mastery of both the structure and the content of courtly love literature, while utterly transforming their meaning. Her work becomes profoundly influential on later mystical expressions of the human search for union with the divine. It also has this interesting gender-bending twist where the soul is always female in the Latin tradition, and God, of course, is always male. So what you have in the picture here is female love shooting an arrow at the male beloved. And this inspires a tradition where, in fact, you get Jesus as the man that the nun is shooting arrows at, and ends up in bed with at the end, by the way. So here's an example of the kind of poetry. So this is from a poem called The Night of Love. And what seems to the loved soul the most beautiful encounter is that it should love the beloved so fully and so gain knowledge of the beloved with love that nothing else be known by it except, I am love, conquered by love. But He who overcame love was rather conquered so that he might in love be brought to nothing. In this lies the power that surpasses everything, that from which love was born from the beginning. So here, Hadwich takes this common trope of the conquering knight who's conquered by love and turns it into a pretty deep meditation about the relation between the soul and God and the nature of our love for God and God's love for us. Another woman who spent a lot of time writing about love and exploring the connection between the human and the divine is Catherine of Siena. She found a very different way of transcending the particular boundaries around her, though. On one sketch, her life looks exactly like you would expect that of a religious woman in the 14th century to look. She's born in 1347 to a solid merchant-class wool-dyeing family. She's the 24th of 25 children. Yeah, take a second for that. Her mother has another child 2 years later that survives. And she's known from a very early age for being pious. She refuses to marry when she hits adolescence, and she retreats to her room in the family house for 3 years to spend time in solitude and prayer. In 1368, she experiences a vision that she relates, that's the picture on the slide is actually of this, of what's called the mystical espousal, where Jesus marries her. And so you see here Mary presenting Jesus and Catherine, right, as they join in union. After this, she receives a call directly from Jesus to go out and do active ministry. And so she joins the Dominican Mantellate, who were formerly only widows. She actually had to fight to get in there. And she participates in a lot of active ministry with the sick and the suffering. In 1380, she dies at 33 years of age. That itself would be a meaningful life. But what I haven't mentioned is her relationship to the Pope, because in the last section of her life, she's involved in this active political correspondence that turns into travel as well, that goes from traveling to Pisa and Lucca to try to calm people down and make peace, all the way to admonishing the Pope about the fact that he's moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon. In 1376, she's sent by the Florentines, in fact, to go intercede with Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome. He does the next year. It's pretty clear that he probably already had his mind made up, but he was also a deeply pious person, and Catherine's intercession apparently really impacted him. So she founds a convent in 1377, where she continues her mission of peacemaking and her frenetic pace of dictating letters. One of the things that's remarkable about her is that, unlike Hadwich, Catherine isn't educated. She learns how to read only when she joins the Mantellate, and she doesn't learn how to write until actually the last couple of years of her life. So she's dictating all these letters, and by the time she dies in 1380, she's written over 300, many of which are political in nature. In 1970, she was made a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, one of only 4 women to receive this honor, and still the only lay, is a not nun, to receive that title. Why? There's a lot of speculation about this, right? And there's a lot of kind of cynical speculation, in fact, that, right, the Florentines were playing her, they sent her because, here's this young woman who can intercede. But she's not made a doctor of the Catholic Church for nothing. The dialogue in her letters show a profound understanding of theology, of philosophy, and in particular of the Dominican sensibilities. So what made her able to talk frankly to people like the Pope is her belief that all human beings start off at the same place, right? So she has this tremendous humility that comes from self-knowledge and that she sees as linking all souls together. So if you look at the quote here, this is the very beginning, it's a prologue to her dialogue. And it starts like this. She's talking about herself. A soul rises up, restless with tremendous desire for God's honor and the salvation of souls. She has for some time exercised herself in virtue and has become accustomed to dwelling in the cell of self-knowledge in order to better know God's goodness toward her, since upon knowledge follows love. And loving, she seeks to pursue truth and clothe herself in it. So just there, you get this reference to the cell of self-knowledge, right? You close yourself away, you introspect, you get to know God's goodness, your love expands, the love helps you learn more, and it becomes this cycle, right? This upward spiral. And part of what grounds this is what truth says to her right after this. Open your mind's eye and look within me, and you will see the dignity and beauty of my reasoning creature, right? So this is how Catherine is experiencing herself as described by God, right? The truth. Dignity and beauty and reason. So you have this, again, 24th of 25 children of a Sienese cloth merchant, wool dyer, and she's able to write this because of the ways that she's found to subvert the kind of restrictions and boundaries that have held her in. Another kind of transcendence is exemplified by Julian of Norwich. Julian, you probably heard of in one way or another. She's famous for the quote that, and all will be well, and it's sort of very pastoral. She has a heart for the world. In May 13, 1373, she receives the Revelations, which she records first as what she calls the short text of the showings of divine love, and then spends 20 years editing and revising into a longer version known as the long text, all of which is based on that original vision, right? So she spends 20 years thinking about, revisiting, interpreting, deepening her understanding, and then sharing it as the showings. She's also famous for this vision, which is portrayed in the picture here, in which she sees the world in the palm of her hand as the size of a hazelnut, right? So I really like this picture because you both have Julian standing, right? She's got the church in back of her. She's got God, handing down the vision, and she's looking at the world in the palm of her hand. She becomes so widely known for practical and theological wisdom that people came from all over to talk to her. Marjorie Kemp, the author of the first autobiography in English, for example, reports visiting Julian specifically for her spiritual guidance. Okay, so where are the walls here? Well, in this case, they're extremely literal. Julian is an anchoress, which means that she was literally walled into a small room on the side of the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. In fact, we don't know what her name is. She takes her name from the church. That photo there is not actually from Julian's cell that got destroyed by bombing in World War II, but it does show you an actual anchoress window into a church. So on the left there, you see the size of this tiny little window. That's how the anchoress would still receive communion. And on the right, you can see from the outside of the church into a tiny window where the anchoress would be able to talk to people who came to visit her, right? So here's a case where she has to be visited by people because she literally can't leave the walls around her, right? And yet, she still manages to have an active impact on practical, intellectual, and theological lives of her entire community, and ongoing. Here are two particularly, I think, exemplary quotes for the kind of expansiveness of her inner vision. So the first one is the hazelnut one, right? So she says, "And in this, he, God, showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut lying in the palm of my hand. And I perceived that it was as round as any ball. I looked at it and thought, what can this be? And I was given the general answer, it is everything which is made. I was amazed that it could last, for I thought that it was so little that it would suddenly fall into nothing. And I was answered in my understanding, it lasts and always will because God loves it. And thus everything has being through the love of God. Right? So like Catherine of Siena and Hadwich, you have this theme where love becomes the means by which you transcend these boundaries. And the second one is one where she looks inside herself. And the language she uses here is particularly interesting. She says, "And then the good Lord opened my spiritual eye and showed me my soul in the midst of my heart. I saw the soul as wide as if it were an endless citadel, and also as if it were a blessed kingdom. And I understood that it's a fine city." Right? So just like with Catherine of Siena, when she's shown the truth of herself, it's humble, it's self-knowledge, but it's the kind of self-knowledge that allows you to go beyond your original restrictions. So to conclude, Hadwich, Catherine of Siena, and Julian of Norwich transcend their boundaries in very different ways. And they offer just a taste for the variety of ways in which medieval women managed to express their creativity, intelligence, and love. One striking similarity between these is both their emphasis on the nature of love and the way that it helps us go beyond, but also how the transcendence of their limits led them each to revalue their own embodied human existence. In this way, and I could talk about this all day, but I can't. In this way, they can serve as a model for us today. If you think about all of us on our iPads and our smartphones and the transhumanism movement, and right, we have this constant desire for transcendence, for going beyond. And there's something really beautiful about the way that these women, in their own restricted context, teach us to embrace rather than try to flee our humanity while still transcending. Right? So in that way, they're a model for us all. Thank you.